She came home to bury the last of her father's memory. Instead, she found 12 armed men standing in her driveway and a man in a black coat waiting on her front porch like he owned the place. Because, she would soon discover, he believed he did. Maren Vale had survived poverty, broken contracts, and a career that never quite caught fire. But nothing in her 31 years had prepared her for the moment Cassian Vescari unfolded a leather document case and laid a single sheet of paper on her father's dusty kitchen table. "Sign," he said. "Or by Monday, this house, that barn, and every painting your father ever touched belongs to me." If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments below, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The estate looked worse than she remembered. Maren Vale turned off the two-lane highway onto the gravel access road and immediately felt the difference. The way the tires caught on the loose stones differently than they used to. The way the tree line had crowded in on both sides until the road felt less like a driveway and more like a throat. She hadn't been back in 14 months. Not since the funeral. Not since she'd stood in the cold November ground beside a coffin she couldn't afford to bury properly, and told herself that selling the property was the practical thing, the adult thing. She told herself a lot of things in the past 14 months. The main house appeared through the break in the oaks just after the second bend. A 3-story craftsman, originally built in 1909, added on to in 3 separate eras by 3 separate owners who'd each left their own confused architectural mark on it. Her father had loved that about it. He used to say a house with contradictions had more character than a house with a plan. Maren had spent her 20s believing him. Now she looked at the sagging front porch, the water-stained siding, the east wing window boarded over since a storm 2 winters ago, and she saw what it actually was, a building that had been loved past the point of reason by a man who couldn't afford to love it. She parked the Subaru near the side entrance and sat for a moment with the engine running. The county assessor's letter was still in her bag. The bank's certified correspondence was in there too, rubber-banded to the assessor's notice with the kind of bureaucratic neatness that felt almost cruel in its tidiness. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 60 days unless the estate settled an outstanding balance she couldn't come close to covering. She was here to inventory what was worth selling and to figure out what the lawyers called a realistic liquidation timeline. What that meant in plain language was figure out what you can get for the furniture before they take the walls. She cut the engine, got out. The October air hit her with that particular Illinois cold that comes off the flat land without warning, carrying the smell of damp soil and dying grass. She pulled her jacket tighter and walked toward the front door. That was when she heard the engines. Not one engine, multiple. She stopped on the porch steps and turned around, and the sound clarified itself. The deep, controlled rumble of heavy vehicles moving in formation, which was a thing you recognized once you'd heard it, even if you'd only heard it on a screen. Through the gap in the oaks, she could already see the first headlights cutting through the gray afternoon. 4 black SUVs came down her access road in a column. They were followed by a 5th. Maren didn't move. She stood on the second porch step with her hand on the railing and watched them park. Watched them do it with a practiced, deliberate efficiency, fanning out across the gravel in a loose semicircle that she understood, even without wanting to understand it, was not accidental. The vehicles were identical. The men who stepped out of them were not in uniform, but there was a uniformity to them anyway. The way they stood, the way they arranged themselves, the way not one of them looked at her except to locate her, and then look away. The passenger door of the lead vehicle opened last. The man who stepped out was taller than she expected, though she couldn't have explained what she'd been expecting. He wore a charcoal wool coat, no tie visible above the buttoned collar of his dark shirt. His hair was black, cut close at the sides, slightly longer on top, and he moved across the gravel with a quality of stillness that she found immediately and deeply unsettling. The way a large predatory animal moves when it isn't in a hurry, because it doesn't need to be. He walked toward her. His men maintained their positions without being told to. He stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at her. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in the flat October light, and there was nothing warm in them. Not hostility exactly, but an absolute absence of performance. He wasn't trying to seem anything. That was the part that frightened her more than the vehicles or the men or the guns she could see holstered on two of the figures behind him. Maren Vale, he said. It wasn't a question. Who are you? Cassian Vescari. He said it the way people say things they've said 10,000 times. Not casually, but with a kind of exhausted precision. I believe you've received correspondence from my legal team. She stared at him. The name hit her somewhere below conscious thought. She'd heard it. She knew she'd heard it. In news segments half watched and conversations half listened to. The Vescari Syndicate, Chicago. Federal investigations that somehow never produced federal charges. A name that appeared in the margins of the kind of news stories that made people feel grateful they lived ordinary lives. You need to get your cars off my property, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That's an interesting position, he said, given that the property in question may already belong to me. She came down one step. She didn't know why. Some reflex that told her staying above him was the only advantage she had. I don't know what you think my father owed you, but I'm not party to any agreement he made, and I'm telling you right now that whatever documentation you think you have, may I come inside? The question was so flat, so utterly free of social lubrication, that it stopped her mid-sentence. He wasn't asking permission. He was extending a courtesy that he clearly did not consider himself obligated to extend. No, she said. The conversation we need to have will take approximately 20 minutes. I'd suggest we have it somewhere warm, but the choice is yours. She looked at his men, then back at him, then at the boarded window on the east wing, as if it might offer some kind of answer. She turned around and opened the front door. Inside, the house smelled like dust and cedar, and the faint chemical undertone of the conservation materials she'd left in the front room on her last visit. Solvents and linseed oil, and the particular metallic smell of restoration work. The floors were original heart pine, warped in 3 places she could identify by sound when she walked over them. The ceiling in the entry hall showed a dark stain from a roof leak 2 years ago that her father had covered with paint rather than fixing. She led him to the kitchen. It was the only room that still felt functional, still felt lived in, even though no one had lived here in over a year. She didn't offer coffee. She stood on one side of the kitchen table and watched him set a flat leather document case on its surface with the careful deliberateness of a man who had done this kind of thing in a lot of kitchens belonging to a lot of people who didn't want him there. He opened the case, removed a single folder, set it on the table and turned it to face her. Your father borrowed money, he said, in 2003, through a series of intermediary lenders who were ultimately operating under the Vescari financial network. She didn't touch the folder. My father didn't. He did. No impatience, just fact. He borrowed against this property and against several future receivables from his restoration contracts. The amount was significant. At the time, it was the only mechanism available to him to prevent the layoffs of 11 employees who had worked for him for more than a decade. Something moved in her chest that she didn't want to examine. She knew about the year her father almost lost the business. She'd been 17. She remembered the tension in the house, the way dinner conversations went quiet, the way her father aged 6 years and 8 months. She had never known exactly what saved it. Even if that's true, she said carefully, whatever he borrowed in 2003 would have. The original terms were structured with a deferred interest clause. The debt matured on the 5th anniversary of your father's death. He looked at her. That was 3 months ago. The number in the folder, when she finally looked, did not feel real. It had too many digits to feel real. She looked at it the way you look at something your brain refuses to fully process, the way you look at a car crash or a diagnosis, with a kind of flat, dissociated clarity. That's not possible, she said. It's compounded interest over 22 years with a penalty clause your father's intermediary signed on his behalf. The mathematics are straightforward. I can't pay that. No. You can't. She looked up. He was watching her with that same quality of complete stillness, and she realized he had known this before he came. He had known every number before he ever got in one of those black vehicles. He had come here not to discuss the debt, but to present the conclusion he'd already reached. Then why are you here? She said. If the number is impossible, why are you here instead of your lawyers? He reached into the folder and removed a second document. Set it beside the first. Because I'm offering you an alternative. She read the document. She read it twice. She set it down on the table and looked at him. You're not serious, she said. I'm never anything else. You're asking me to marry you. I'm offering you a contract, he said. 12 months. A legal marriage, documented for all purposes, publicly acknowledged. At the end of that period, the debt is considered settled in full, this property returns to you with clear title, and we proceed to an uncontested dissolution. No financial obligation from either party. That's insane. It's a business arrangement. You want a wife. I want a specific kind of public alliance at a specific moment in time. There was no embarrassment in how he said it, no apology, no romantic inflation of the language. My position requires a certain legitimacy that my current circumstances don't provide. A marriage to someone with your family's name and your professional reputation serves that purpose. The arrangement is mutually beneficial. You save the estate. I secure a particular political and social credibility that my legal team has identified as strategically necessary. You can't be serious, she said again, but this time it came out quieter, because she could see from his face that he was. She picked up the document again, read it more slowly. The language was almost aggressively clean. A legal team had spent real hours on this, and they'd been careful. The terms were laid out with the kind of precision that told you everything had been considered. Residency requirements, public appearance obligations. A behavioral clause she read 3 times and still didn't fully believe. A dissolution timeline. And at the bottom, a single line that erased the number from the first document. What if I refuse? She said. Then the debt proceeds to collection. The estate goes to foreclosure. My attorneys have already filed preliminary paperwork with the county. You would receive the standard 60-day notice. He paused. I imagine you already have. She thought about the rubber-banded letters in her bag. And my father's work, she said. The paintings. The restoration archive. Liquidated to offset the debt. The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Her father had spent 40 years building that archive. Documentation of restoration projects, original surveys, correspondence with museums and private collectors, photographs of work that no longer existed anywhere else. It wasn't valuable in the way that produced numbers on a balance sheet, but it was irreplaceable in the way that mattered more than numbers. She looked at the document on the table. She looked at Cassian Vescari, who was looking at her with no expression she could read, no impatience, no pressure beyond the simple physical pressure of the situation itself. Give me until tomorrow morning, she said. You have until tomorrow morning, he said, as if he'd already anticipated this request and already agreed to it. He closed the document case and picked it up. My driver will come for your answer at 8 o'clock. If the answer is yes, bring the signed contract and whatever you need for the following week. If the answer is no, my legal team will proceed accordingly. He looked around the kitchen once, not with sentiment, not with cruelty, just with the measuring quality of someone cataloging a space. The house is structurally better than it looks, he said. The bones are good. He walked back toward the front door. Mr. Vescari? He stopped in the entry hall. Why my father? She said. Out of everyone who might have borrowed from your network, why would you structure a deal that ends like this? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, your father was an honest man. In my experience, that's rarer than money. He opened the front door. 8 o'clock, Ms. Vale. The convoy left the way it came, in formation, without hurry. She watched the last taillight disappear around the second bend and then stood in the empty front room with her hands pressed flat against the cold windowsill until the sound of the engines faded completely. She didn't sleep that night. She went through the archive instead. 3 hours in the East Room, pulling document boxes off shelves and going through her father's files with a flashlight when the overhead bulb blew at midnight. She found his contractor records, his employee rosters from 2001, 2002, 2003. She found the year in question, a single folder, thin and battered, labeled only with the year. Inside it were termination notices he had typed and then never sent. 11 of them. She read all 11 names and recognized 6 of them from her childhood. People who had come to his funeral, people who had wept at the graveside of a man they'd worked beside for 2 decades. She found no record of any loan, No documentation of any transaction, but that didn't mean it hadn't happened. At 4 a.m., she sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and the contract on the floor in front of her, and she tried to think about it the way you were supposed to think about decisions, rationally, strategically, with distance. She tried to treat it as a calculation. 12 months. 1 year of her life. In exchange for this house, this land, her father's archive, everything that remained of a life he'd spent building something. Against what? A year of proximity to a man whose name appeared in federal investigation footnotes? A year of being someone's arranged wife? A year of… what? Exactly. She read the behavioral clause again. It was specific without being invasive. She would be required to attend a certain number of public events. She would be required to present as his spouse in professional contexts. She would not be required to share any physical space she was uncomfortable sharing. That clause was there, in the document, in black ink. She thought about what it meant that a man like Cassian Vescari had thought to put that in writing. At 6 a.m., she took a shower in water that was only barely warm and stood in the bathroom mirror for a long time looking at the woman standing in it. She looked tired. She looked like someone making a decision they would probably not stop questioning for the rest of their life. She found a pen on the kitchen counter, sat at the table, put the contract in front of her. She signed it at 6:47 a.m. with her hand steady and her jaw tight and the feeling in her stomach like a stone dropped into cold water, the moment of release before the sinking starts. When the black SUV arrived at 8:02, she was standing on the porch with a duffel bag at her feet and the signed contract in her hand. The driver got out without speaking and opened the rear passenger door. She picked up the bag. She took one long look at the house, at the sagging porch and the boarded window and the water stain visible through the front room glass. And she thought about her father, about 11 letters he never sent, about all the things he'd done without asking her permission, without telling her why, without knowing that the cost would eventually land here, in her hands, on a cold October morning outside Chicago. She got in the car, the door closed. The driver returned to his seat. The vehicle moved. She did not look back. She was 40 minutes outside the city, watching the flat Illinois landscape pull past the tinted windows, when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it. 3 words. No signature. Read the journals. She stared at the screen. Her thumbs hovered. She typed back, "Who is this?" No response came. The city appeared on the horizon, and she sat in the back of Cassian Vescari's vehicle with a stranger's 3-word text burning in her palm, and the feeling, arriving late, like a punch to the ribs that takes a second to register, that she had not in fact made this decision. Someone had made it for her. The city swallowed the vehicle whole. Maren watched Chicago reassemble itself outside the tinted window. The expressway feeding into surface streets. The surface streets narrowing into the kind of neighborhood that announced money not through ostentation, but through restraint. No neon, no crowds, just clean stone facades and iron gates, and the particular silence of blocks where the buildings themselves seemed to understand that noise was a form of weakness. The SUV turned onto a street she didn't recognize and stopped in front of a building that occupied most of the block. A converted 19th century warehouse, 6 stories, the original brick sandblasted back to something almost beautiful, the windows replaced with thick dark glass that reflected the street back at itself without revealing anything inside. There was no signage. There was no doorman visible. There were, however, 2 men flanking the entrance who were not trying to look like anything other than what they were. The driver opened her door. She got out with her duffel bag and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the building the way you look at a thing you're about to become part of. Cassian was already inside. She found him in a room on the 4th floor that functioned as a study. Walls of dark-stained shelving carrying books that looked read rather than decorative. A desk that was large and clear and working. 2 leather chairs positioned near the windows with a low table between them. He was on the phone when she entered. He held up 2 fingers without looking at her. 2 minutes. And she stood near the door and waited. She used the time to look at the room, to look at him in the room. He stood with his back partially to her, one hand in his coat pocket, his voice low and clipped in a way that told her the call was not going well for whoever was on the other end. She caught fragments. The timeline moves up. Tell Reyes it moves up, or tell Reyes to find a different arrangement. A pause. I don't care what he expected. I care what he agreed to. He ended the call without a closing statement and set the phone on the desk and turned to her. Your room is on the 3rd floor, he said. Ines will show you. She manages the household. I want to know who sent me that text. He looked at her without the flicker of someone caught off guard. What text? She showed him her phone. He read the 3 words. His expression didn't change, but something in the way he looked at the phone, just a fraction of a second too long, told her it meant something to him. Unknown number, she said. Sent while I was in your car. Read the journals. Whose journals? My father didn't keep journals. I'll look into it. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. He moved to the desk and picked up his phone again, not to dismiss her, but with the manner of a man whose attention is distributed across too many things simultaneously. Settle in. We have an event Thursday evening, a charity auction at the Hargrove Gallery, which is our first public appearance together. You'll receive a briefing document by tomorrow afternoon. A briefing document. Covering who will be there, what they know, what they don't know, and what you'll need to say if asked about how we met. She set her bag on the floor. You have a cover story. I have a narrative. There's a difference. He glanced up. The narrative is close enough to the truth that it doesn't require memorization. We met through your father's professional network. We maintained a private relationship for some time before deciding to formalize it. That's all anyone needs. And people will believe that. People believe what they want to believe about powerful men and the women who choose them. He said it without any self-congratulation, just as a fact of mechanics. They'll find it romantic. They'll find you brave or naive depending on their own dispositions. None of that matters. What matters is that the marriage appears genuine. Does it need to appear genuine to your own people? The question landed differently than she expected it to. She could see that from the slight shift in how he was holding himself, not defensive, but recalibrated. My household staff is loyal, he said. That's not what I asked. A beat. My senior people know the arrangement is contractual. They don't need to know the specifics. And Lucian Sorrell? She had looked up the name last night in the hour before she went through the archive. It had appeared in 3 of the same news segments that mentioned Vescari, always described as an advisor, always photographed at a slight distance, always looking at whoever he was speaking to with the attentiveness of a man who is remembering rather than listening. Cassian set the phone down again. This time, he was fully still. Where did you hear that name? Public record, she said. He's your primary advisor. He's been with the syndicate for, 15 years? If the marriage needs to appear real to anyone, it's to the person closest to your operation. She held his gaze. Does he know? Lucien knows what I choose to tell him. That's a very careful answer. I give careful answers. She picked up her bag. I'll find the 3rd floor myself. Inez turned out to be a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s who ran the household with the organized efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that comfort and security were not opposites. She showed Maren to a room on the 3rd floor that was large and clean and thoughtfully furnished without being impersonal. A genuine bedroom, not a hotel reconstruction of one. There was a writing desk near the window, a bookshelf that held a mix of art history and fiction, a closet that already contained, to Maren's distinct unease, several items of clothing in approximately her size. He had someone pull together some basics, Inez said, reading her face. You won't be expected to use them if they're not to your taste. He knew I'd say yes. Inez's expression didn't offer her anything. Will there be anything else, Ms. Vale? Maren, she said. Maren. The older woman moved to the door. Dinner's at 7. Mr. Vescari takes it in the dining room when he's home. There's no obligation. Inez. The woman stopped. Has there been anyone else, in this arrangement, I mean? Before me? Inez looked at her for a moment with a quality of evaluation that reminded Maren uncomfortably of the way Cassian himself looked at things. No, she said. Not like this. And then she left. Maren sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the clothes hanging in the open closet and felt the full weight of the morning land on her all at once. The signed contract, the convoy, the text message, the city visible through the window of a building that now contained her for the next 12 months, like an agreement she was only beginning to understand the terms of. She unpacked her duffel bag. She put her own things in the closet and closed it. Then she sat back down on the bed and opened her phone and stared at the 3-word text until the screen dimmed. Read the journals. Her father had never kept a journal. She had gone through his papers twice after the funeral, once with the estate lawyer, once alone, and she had found nothing resembling a personal record. Her father was not a man who wrote about himself. He wrote about other things: buildings, methods, material degradation, the particular problem of restoring a surface that had been painted over too many times by people who didn't understand what was underneath. But he had kept notebooks for his projects, dozens of them. She had pulled them from the archive without fully cataloging them because there were too many, and the estate lawyer had told her personal professional notes had no value to a creditor. They were still in boxes in the East Room. She was still thinking about this when her phone rang. Unknown number, different from the text. She answered it. "Miss Vale," a man's voice, measured, educated, carrying the particular lightness of someone who had practiced sounding harmless. "I hope the transition has been comfortable." "Who is this?" "My name is Lucien Sorrel. I'm Cassian's senior advisor. I wanted to introduce myself before Thursday, since we'll be in the same room for most of the evening." She stood up from the bed. "How did you get this number?" "I'm very good at my job." A brief pause that had a smile inside it. "I also wanted to say, entirely informally and without any official weight behind it, that I think what you've agreed to is brave. And I hope you know that if you find yourself needing information about the arrangement, about Cassian, about anything that might clarify what you've walked into, I'm available." Genuinely available. Cassian is a man who operates on a need-to-know principle, and he applies that principle even to people he's legally bound to. I'd hate for you to feel more alone than necessary. The warmth in his voice was expertly calibrated. It sat at exactly the right temperature. Not intrusive, not threatening, not quite friendly. It was the warmth of a man who had studied warmth and could reproduce it with precision. "Thank you," she said. "I think I have what I need." "Of course." Another pause. "Oh, one small thing. You had a text message this morning. Strange number. You should know that communications on this network can sometimes generate glitches. Messages routing incorrectly, fragments of other conversations appearing as new messages. Nothing to be concerned about." He kept his voice entirely casual. "But I'd delete it if I were you, just to keep your device clean." He hung up. Maren stood in the middle of the room with her phone in her hand and her heart hitting her sternum at a pace that had nothing to do with exertion. He knew about the text. He knew what it said, or he knew enough to know she'd received it. He'd called to make sure she deleted it. She did not delete it. She took a screenshot of it first, emailed the screenshot to herself from a secondary account she used for nothing important, deleted the email from her sent folder, and then opened the text thread and stared at it for another 30 seconds before deciding to leave it. If he was monitoring her device, and she had to assume now that someone was, deleting it might tell him more than leaving it. She went down to dinner. Cassian was already at the table when she arrived. There were 2 place settings: candles that were practical rather than romantic, and food that had been prepared by someone who understood cooking as a form of exactness rather than expression. Everything correct, nothing showing off. He looked up when she sat down. He registered something in her face, and he waited. "Lucien Sorrel called me," she said. He put his fork down. He introduced himself, said he wanted me to feel comfortable before Thursday. She watched Cassian's jaw tighten by a degree. He also knew about the text I received this morning and suggested I delete it. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that has texture to it. "What exactly did he say?" he said. She told him. All of it, verbatim, the way she'd replayed it in the elevator coming down. His phrasing, his pauses, the shape of the offer under the warmth of it. Cassian picked his fork up again. Set it back down. stood up from the table and went to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she could see in the set of his shoulders something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite alarm, but lived somewhere between them. "He had no business contacting you," Cassian said. "No, he didn't." She kept her voice even. "Is he the kind of man who does things he has no business doing?" Cassian turned around. "Lucien has been with this organization for 15 years. He is meticulous, effective, and the best operational mind I've encountered in this industry." He came back to the table and sat down. "He is also a man who believes that information is the only real currency and that he should therefore always have more of it than anyone else in the room." "Including you." A beat. "Including me." "Does he know why you needed this marriage? The real reason?" Cassian looked at her. "There are things I don't discuss at the dinner table." "Then when?" "When I decide they're relevant to tell you." She reached for her water glass. "That's going to be a problem." "Why?" "Because someone sent me a message telling me to read my father's journals, and then your most trusted advisor called me within 6 hours of my arrival to tell me to delete it." She set the glass down. "Either Lucien sent me that message and is running some kind of game I don't understand yet, or someone else sent it and Lucien found out, which means someone in this building is watching my communications. Either way, I'm not going to survive the next 12 months by accepting a need-to-know arrangement." The silence that followed had a different quality from his earlier silences. This one was evaluative. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Why do you need the marriage to look real right now? Specifically, what's happening in the next 12 months that requires a wife?" He looked at her for a long time. Then, "There's a proposed federal task force being assembled. 3 agencies. Their primary mechanism is not criminal prosecution. It's financial destabilization. They target the families and business associates of persons of interest, creating enough economic and social disruption to force those persons of interest into either exposure or capitulation." He refilled his water glass. "A married man with demonstrable community ties and a stable personal life is a substantially less productive target than a single man with exclusively criminal associations. You need to look normal. I need to look like someone who has reasons to stay." She thought about that. "And this task force, is it being pushed by someone specific? Someone with a reason to want you specifically destabilized?" He looked at her with something that was almost surprise. "Why do you ask it that way?" "Because the way you described it," she said, "it doesn't sound like routine law enforcement. It sounds personal." He picked up his fork for the 3rd time, and this time he actually used it. "Go through your father's restoration notebooks," he said, as if the topic had changed. "If someone sent you that message, they meant something specific by it. Find out what." She stared at him. "You know what's in them." "I know what might be in them." "Then tell me." "Find it yourself first." He met her eyes. "So you know I haven't told you what to think about it." She didn't sleep much that second night either. She spent most of it on the phone with the estate caretaker she'd hired to maintain the property until the foreclosure was finalized, arranging for one of the archive boxes from the East Room to be sent to the city address. Then she lay in the dark in a room that smelled faintly of cedar and someone else's careful choices, and stared at the ceiling and tried to organize what she knew. The Thursday event arrived before the box did. The Hargrove Gallery occupied a converted carriage house in the Gold Coast, and the charity auction inside it was the kind of event where every surface was beautiful and every person in the room was performing a version of themselves they'd spent considerable effort constructing. Maren wore a dark green dress she'd found in the closet. She'd told herself she wouldn't, and then she'd looked at her own clothes and been honest about it. And she came downstairs to find Cassian waiting in the entry hall in a black suit that fit him with the precision of something made for his exact body. He looked at her the way she was beginning to recognize as his mode of looking at things. Total measuring without performance. "You'll be asked how we met," he said. "You know what to say? Your professional network, private relationship, recently formalized." She kept her voice dry. "Yes. If anyone asks about the estate, my father's property is in the process of being transferred to a restoration foundation. I'm the managing director." She tilted her head. "You sent me the briefing document. I read it." Something that might have been amusement crossed his face. It disappeared before it arrived. Shall we? In the car, she sat beside him in the back and felt the careful distance between them, the deliberate 6 inches of seat that separated their respective postures, and thought about how strange it was to be performing intimacy with someone she'd met 2 days ago by rehearsing exactly how to perform it. The gallery was already crowded when they arrived. She felt the shift in the room when they entered. Not universal, not dramatic, but a ripple of attention moving outward from the entrance that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the man beside her. People looked at Cassian Vescari the way they look at things they're not sure whether to approach or avoid, and several of them resolved this uncertainty by approaching him with their hands extended and their faces arranged into expressions of careful welcome. He introduced her as his wife. Every time he did it, something in her stomach did something she chose not to examine. She held herself together through 3 conversations and 1 glass of champagne before a woman in her late 40s materialized at her shoulder with the specific quality of approach that signals I have been waiting for this opportunity. She introduced herself as Valerie Crane, wife of a city alderman, and her interest in Maren was so pointed and precise that it was almost flattering. I didn't know Cassian was seeing anyone, Valerie said, with a smile that had fingernails inside it. He's been so private for so long. That was the point, Maren said. Privacy. Of course. Valerie's eyes were doing a specific kind of work, looking at Maren's hands, her posture, the way she was standing relative to Cassian across the room, looking for the seams of the performance. And how long ago did you say? I didn't, Maren said pleasantly. A commotion near the south entrance disrupted the conversation before Valerie could rearrange her approach. A man had entered the gallery, tall, silver-haired, moving with the easy authority of someone who doesn't need to announce himself, and the room's attention organized itself around him with the same reflexive gravity it had arranged around Cassian, but differently. Where people moved toward Cassian with caution, they moved toward this man with something closer to relief. Cassian went very still across the room. The silver-haired man scanned the gallery and found Cassian's gaze, and the 2 of them held that look across 20 feet of crowded space for a moment that Maren felt in her back teeth. She crossed to Cassian's side. Who is that? Alderman Crane's business partner, Cassian said, quietly and without moving his mouth very much. His name is Dominic Fall. He's not supposed to be in Chicago this week. But he is. But he is. A pause. He's walking toward us. Dominic Fall was warm in the way of politicians and sales executives, a warmth that arrived before he did, that preceded him into the space and smoothed it. He took Cassian's hand and shook it with the particular grip of men who have spent years measuring each other through handshakes, and then he turned to Maren, and his eyes did something that had nothing to do with the smile on his face. This must be the new Mrs. Vescari, he said. I've heard. Have you? Cassian said. Not a question. Word travels. Fall kept his eyes on Maren. Your father was Thomas Vale, yes? The restoration specialist. That's right. Remarkable man. I knew him. Oh, years ago, through a mutual associate. Something moved behind his eyes. I was sorry to hear he passed. He was the kind of man who understood what things were really worth. He looked at Cassian. We should find time this week. There are matters that have moved since we last spoke. I'll have Lucienne reach out, Cassian said. Yes. Fall's smile didn't move. Lucienne, of course. He nodded once precisely and moved away. Maren waited until Fall was absorbed back into the crowd. Then, he knew my father. Apparently. That's not a coincidence. No. Cassian's voice was controlled in the way of something containing pressure. It isn't. She turned to look at him directly, which at this distance and in this room required a kind of deliberate performance of casualness she was getting better at. Cassian, whatever is happening, whatever the real reason for this marriage is, beyond the task force narrative, I need you to understand that I am standing here in front of people who are watching us, and I cannot do that effectively if I'm operating without information I need. She kept her voice low and even. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm telling you that the architecture of what we're doing requires me to know what I'm standing in the middle of. He looked at her. For the first time since she'd met him, something cracked slightly in the surface of his expression. Not weakness, not vulnerability, but something that might have been the acknowledgement of a problem he'd been trying to manage alone for too long. "After Thursday," he said. "Tonight. We talk." "Tonight," she agreed. They left the gallery at 10:15. The ride back was quiet in the way of two people who have made an agreement and are holding it between them. When they arrived at the building, she followed him to his study on the 4th floor, and he poured 2 glasses of something amber and set one in front of her and sat down across the desk instead of behind it. He talked for 40 minutes. Not everything. She could sense the architecture of what he was omitting. But enough. The task force was real, but it was a symptom, not the source. Someone inside the legitimate financial networks that the syndicate used as cover had been systematically redirecting assets for 2 years. Not stealing exactly, but moving money in ways that created a trail that could be made to look criminal if someone decided to make it look that way. Someone was building a case. Not law enforcement. Something else. Something that had the tools and the patience of an institution, but the motivation of a personal agenda. "And you think Fall is involved," she said. "I think Fall knows more about my father's history with your father than he should," Cassian said. "I think the fact that someone in my network sent you a message about journals before you even arrived here means someone wanted you to find something before Fall, or whoever Fall works with, made sure you couldn't." She was quiet for a moment. "The box from the estate, my father's notebooks. It arrives tomorrow." "Yes." "You knew I'd send for them." "I hoped you would." She picked up the glass, put it down without drinking. "Cassian, the original debt, the loan from 2003. You told me it was through intermediary lenders. Was it always going to mature the way it did? Or was the maturation structure added later?" He looked at her steadily. "The original terms didn't include the penalty clause that created the number you saw in the folder." Something cold moved through her. Someone altered the terms. "Someone altered the terms," he said. "After your father died, when the debt transferred to estate liability." He looked at his hands for a moment. "The document your father signed in 2003 was not the document that came to you." The room felt different. The air in it felt different. "Then the debt that forced me to sign was manufactured," he said, "or significantly inflated." "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the city was doing what cities do at night. Moving, glittering, going about its business without any knowledge of or interest in the conversation happening in a 4th-floor study above it. "Why didn't you tell me this before I signed?" she said. "Because I didn't know for certain. And because—" He stopped, started again. "Because someone arranged this marriage, Ms. Vale. Someone who is not me engineered the circumstances that brought you to that kitchen table with that document, and I needed to know whether you were part of the engineering or the target of it." She turned around. "And now?" "And now I'm fairly certain you're the target." He held her gaze. "Which means you're in this building for reasons that go beyond my needing a wife." She stood at the window for a long moment. Then she crossed back to the desk, picked up the glass she hadn't touched, and drank it. "When that box arrives tomorrow," she said, "we go through it together." He nodded once. She went to the door, her hand on the frame. She turned back. "Cassian." He looked at her. The message said, "Read the journals," not "read the notebooks." My father kept notebooks. Journals is a different word. Someone who sent that text knew the difference. She left him with that and went upstairs and lay down on the bed in the dark. And she was almost asleep when her phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. One word this time. Soon. She stared at the ceiling for a very long time after that, listening to the city, and somewhere in the distance a car alarm went off and then silenced itself, and the building settled around her with the sounds of old bones, and she lay very still and felt the particular sensation of a situation that has been larger than you understood it to be from the very beginning. Not growing, not changing, just finally showing you how big it was all along. The archive box arrived at 9 a.m. the next morning. She was already downstairs when Inez signed for it. She carried it to the study herself and set it on the low table between the two leather chairs and opened it. The notebooks were stacked in the order she'd packed them, chronological, earliest at the bottom. She lifted them out one by one and set them on the table and stopped when she reached the ones from 2001 through 2004, which were what she'd come for. She pulled the 2003 notebook out and opened it to the first page, and her father's handwriting was there, dense and slanted and familiar enough to put a fist through her chest. She turned pages. Project notes, material specifications, supply chain records, correspondence summaries. She turned more pages, faster, looking for something that didn't fit the pattern. She found it near the back. Not a separate section, not marked, just a single page tucked between two pages of technical notes, covered not in project documentation but in a different kind of writing, smaller, faster, the handwriting of someone writing for themselves rather than for a record. She read it twice before she understood what it was. It wasn't a journal entry. It was an account. A witness account written in the measured language of a man who understood that what he was writing might someday matter to someone who needed the truth more than they needed him to protect it. It described a meeting, a warehouse, Chicago, winter of 2002. Her father had been there to document the structural condition of a building scheduled for conversion. He had arrived early. He had found 3 men and a set of financial documents that he was not supposed to see. One of the men was Dominic Fall. One of the men he didn't name. The third he described by a detail that made Maren's hands go cold on the page. A scar along the left jaw, thin and white, running from the ear to the chin. She looked up from the page. Cassian Vescari stood in the doorway of the study. He was already dressed, already alert, already carrying the particular quality of a man whose morning had started with information that had changed the shape of something. "I need to show you something," she said. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair across from her. She handed him the notebook, open to the page. He read it. She watched his face while he read it. She watched it do the thing she was beginning to understand it only did when something actually hit him. A slight, controlled stillness, the kind that wasn't absence but concentration. He finished. He set the notebook on the table with the care of someone handling something that has become evidence. "The man with the scar," she said. "You know who he is." Cassian looked up at her, and what was in his face then was not something she had a word for yet. Not fear, not guilt, but something older and more structural, something that had been in the foundations for a long time and had just been found. "He's dead," Cassian said. "That's not what I asked." "His name was Altieri. He was my father's financial officer for 12 years. He stopped. He died 3 months after your father would have written that page." The silence in the room organized itself around a shape neither of them had named yet. "My father witnessed something he wasn't supposed to witness," Maren said, "and he wrote it down. And someone has known about this notebook for long enough to build an entire financial structure designed to bring it to light at exactly the right moment. Or to bury it," Cassian said, "depending on who finds it first." Her phone buzzed on the table. She turned it over. Different number. Not the unknown contact. A number she recognized, the estate caretaker she'd spoken to 2 nights ago. The text was 4 words. "Someone broke in last night." Maren looked at Cassian. He was already on his feet. "They know you have the box," he said. "Then we have maybe hours before—" The building's alarm system activated with a sound like a struck nerve. Sharp, sustained, filling every floor. And 2 floors below them she heard Cassian's men moving, heard doors opening, heard the controlled and rapid communication of people responding to a threat that had already arrived. Cassian was at the door. He looked back at her once. "Take the notebook," he said. "Don't put it down." She grabbed it. She was already moving when the lights went out. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. Maren counted them without deciding to. 1, 2, 3, 4. Standing in the study with the notebook pressed flat against her chest, and her shoulder blades against the bookshelf, and her eyes doing the useless thing eyes do in total darkness, manufacturing shapes out of nothing, offering the brain movement where there was only absence. The emergency lighting came up on the 5th second. Not full power, a reduced, amber-tinted system that turned every surface the color of old photographs and made the study feel like a room in someone's memory rather than an actual place. Cassian was already in the hallway. She could hear him, not his voice but his footsteps, controlled and rapid on the hardwood, and beneath that she could hear the building doing things buildings only do when they are full of people responding to a threat. She went after him. The stairwell was lit by a single emergency strip along the baseboard, enough to see the steps, not enough to see much else. She took the stairs down 2 floors with the notebook tucked under her left arm and her right hand trailing the wall for orientation, and she emerged into the main corridor of the 2nd floor to find 3 of Cassian's men moving in a formation that told her they'd been drilled for exactly this scenario. 2 ahead, 1 at the rear, covering angles with the economical precision of people who did not think of themselves as security, but as something more structural than that. Cassian was at the end of the corridor, speaking in a low, rapid voice to a man she recognized as his head of household security, a wide-shouldered man named Drexel, who moved with the deliberate quality of someone who had learned long ago that urgency and panic were not the same thing. She reached them. Cassian looked at her, at the notebook under her arm, and something in his posture adjusted slightly. "Building exterior," Drexel said, without being asked. "South side. Someone cut the power feed at the junction box on the street level. Not a malfunction. A deliberate cut." "How many?" Cassian said. "We're still assessing. The cameras on the south face went down with the power. North and east are still operational." Drexel's jaw was tight. "We have 1 confirmed point of attempted entry. Rear service entrance. Whoever it was didn't get through, but they weren't trying very hard to get through." Cassian looked at him. "They were moving us." "That's what I think." "Moving us toward what?" Drexel didn't answer immediately. Maren watched the 2 men look at each other with the language of people who have worked together long enough to have an entire conversation in the space between sentences. "The front entrance," Drexel said. "We've had a vehicle parked on the opposite side of the street since approximately 11 p.m. last night. I clocked it as routine surveillance, city contracts, nothing threatening. But if the intention was to push everyone toward the front of the building, then surveillance wasn't the purpose," Maren said. Both men looked at her. "If you push people away from the south and east and toward the front," she said, "you're not trying to get in. You're trying to see who comes out. And in what order." She looked at Cassian. "They want to know who's in the building. They want a visual inventory." Cassian held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to Drexel. "Nobody goes to the front. Confirm the south entry is secured and get the power restored. Do it quietly." He looked at Maren. "Upstairs. Now." They went back to the study. The emergency lighting gave the room a quality that made everything feel suspended, like a scene paused mid-motion, waiting to be told what happens next. Cassian closed the door and went to the desk and opened a lower drawer and removed a secondary phone, which he turned over in his hands once before setting it on the desk in front of him. "Drexel's right that it's not a break-in," he said. "This is reconnaissance. Someone wanted to look at this building, and they wanted to do it in a way that forced movement." "Your own people wouldn't do this," Maren said. It was half statement, half question. 3 months ago, I would have told you no without pausing." He said it with the flatness of someone who has recently revised a certainty. "Now I'm less confident." She sat in one of the leather chairs and set the notebook on the table and looked at him. "Tell me who knew about the box, about the archive materials I requested from the estate." "I knew. Inez knew because she arranged the receiving. Drexel knew because anything arriving at this address is logged through him." "And Lucy Yen?" The word landed in the room and sat there. Cassian was very still. "Lucien manages all incoming correspondence. It's possible he was informed as part of the standard intake process." "It's possible, or it happened." He didn't answer. "Cassian." She leaned forward. "Lucien called me within 6 hours of my arrival and told me to delete a message I'd received from an unknown number. He knew the content of that message. He either sent it himself as a test, or someone else sent it and he found out about it through access to my communications. Access he could only have if he was monitoring this building's network." She stopped. "Which means he's been monitoring you." Cassian sat down behind the desk. He did it the way exhausted people sit. Not heavily, but with a particular quality of controlled descent, like someone who has been holding something up for a long time and has chosen this moment to set it down, briefly, without letting it fall. I've had suspicions for 2 months, he said, about discrepancies. Financial movements I didn't authorize that were difficult to trace because they followed patterns I'd approved in other contexts. Documents that had been accessed and resecured without being altered. Someone studying your operation from the inside. Someone mapping it, learning how it worked before they... He stopped. Before they what? He looked at her. Before they took it. The study was very quiet. Outside, the city continued. Below them, she could hear the distant sound of the building systems coming back online. A low hum, the return of the HVAC, the gradual brightening of the emergency strips as the standard lighting prepared to reassert itself. The notebook, Cassian said. The account your father wrote. The warehouse meeting in 2002. He was looking at the notebook on the table with the focused attention of a man doing difficult mathematics in his head. Altieri, my father's financial officer, was handling a specific set of accounts at that time. Accounts that were never fully audited after his death because the circumstances of his death were attributed to a rival family action. There was no investigation from the inside because it suited everyone to accept that explanation. But the accounts, Maren said. What happened to the accounts he was managing? They were consolidated, redistributed. He paused. By Lucien, who was the junior operational manager at the time and used the chaos after Altieri's death to position himself as the necessary solution. Maren sat back in her chair. The shape of it was assembling itself in the air between them. Not finished, not complete, but enough to see the outline of. Lucien killed Altieri, she said. I think it's likely he arranged it. And I think your father saw something in that warehouse that connected Altieri to whatever Lucien was building at the time. Building with Dominic Fall, who was already positioned in the city's political structure. And when Lucien found out my father had been in that warehouse, he needed insurance. He needed to know what your father had seen and what he'd recorded. But your father was connected to me, to my family's protection, in an informal way that went back years. So Lucien couldn't move on him directly. He structured the debt instead, Maren said. The coldness of it moved through her like water. My father borrowed legitimately in 2003, through your network, with your family's implicit protection. But Lucien was already in position by then. He managed the terms. He made sure the structure would mature into something catastrophic, under the right conditions. And when your father died and the debt transferred to the estate, Lucien altered the terms, added the penalty clause, made the number impossible. She looked at her hands. They were completely steady, which surprised her because the anger in her chest was not steady at all. It was moving, burning, looking for something to land on. He manufactured the situation that brought me to the table. He manufactured the contract that brought me here. He manufactured this marriage, Cassian said, not with anger, with a kind of stripped bare clarity that was harder to look at than anger. Why? She said. What does he get from this? From us being in the same room? Your father's evidence, Cassian said. If the account in that notebook goes public, it doesn't just implicate Altieri. Altieri is dead. It implicates the men Altieri was meeting with. It implicates Fall. And Fall has been Lucien's political cover for 15 years, the legitimate face of a network that goes significantly deeper than either my operation or the city's financial structure. So he needed to control the evidence, she said. He needed to either destroy it or use it. He couldn't find it while your father was alive. After the funeral, the estate went to you. He needed access to the archive, but you were the only person who could provide it. He couldn't approach you directly. So he engineered a reason for me to bring it to him. She felt something move through her that wasn't nausea and wasn't rage, but lived between them like a third thing. I carried my father's evidence into his hands, inside a box, in Cassian Vescari's building, which Lucien has been mapping for 2 months, so he knows exactly where it is. The full lights came back on. The study returned to itself, clear, defined, the books on the walls reasserting their solidity, the desk a desk again rather than a piece of dim amber furniture in a suspended moment. Maren blinked. Cassian's face in full light looked older than it had looked last night. Not weathered, precise. like a face that has been doing hard mathematics for a very long time. His phone rang. Not the secondary phone on the desk, the one in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen, and something in his face changed in a way that she hadn't seen before, and that frightened her more than the power outage or the convoy or any of it. He answered it. He said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then, "Where?" Another silence. "Don't touch anything until I get there." He ended the call. She was already on her feet. "What happened?" "Two men." His voice was controlled in the way of something very close to the surface that has been forced back down. "Two of my captains, found an hour ago." He put the phone in his pocket. "They were killed last night." The room held that sentence for a moment. "Staged," he said before she could ask. "The method, the location, it's designed to look like I ordered it." "Ordered it why?" "Because both men were reportedly in contact with the federal task force, as informants." He looked at her steadily. "I did not know that. Someone did." "Lucien. Lucien." He moved to the door. "He's been building this for a long time. The intelligence that those men were talking to federal investigators, if he had that, he had leverage. He was either planning to use it against me, or to use me to eliminate them, and then use the elimination to bury me with the task force." He stopped at the door. "Either way, as of this morning, I am the primary suspect in two murders that will become federal matters by end of day." The architecture of it was complete now. She could see the whole shape of it. "He's making his move," she said. "Yes." "Which means he knows you found out." "Which means I have significantly less time than I thought." She picked up the notebook from the table and crossed the room to him. "Then we can't let him have this." He looked at the notebook in her hand, then at her. "Maren, I'm not giving it to you to protect me," she said. "I'm telling you that this is the only piece of documentation that connects Fall to whatever Lucien built in 2002. And if Lucien gets it before we can leverage it, he doesn't just win the syndicate. He burns the evidence and you go down for two murders, and there's nothing left." She held his gaze. "Where can it go that Lucien can't reach?" Before he could answer, the door to the study opened. Lucien Sorrel walked in. He was immaculate. That was the first thing, the absolute offensive immaculateness of him, the dark suit without a wrinkle, the silver hair precisely in place, the quality of a man who had spent the last hour preparing to enter this room while they spent the last hour discovering everything he'd done. He had a quality of rehearsed calm that was different from Cassian's genuine stillness. It was a performance of stillness, and now that she knew what he was, she could see the performance in it the way you see the frame of a painting once someone has pointed it out. He looked at Cassian first. "There are federal agents at the building's main entrance," he said. "Drexel is handling it, but they'll be inside within the hour. Cassian, we need to discuss how you want to manage—" "Stop," Cassian said. Something flickered behind Lucien's eyes. Not surprise. The anticipation of a man who has crossed a threshold and is now calibrating how much the person on the other side knows. "You altered the loan documents," Cassian said, "after Thomas Vale died." The room temperature didn't change. The sounds of the building didn't change. But something in the quality of the air in the study shifted, pressurized, like the moment before a change in weather that you can feel before you can see. Lucien looked at Maren, then at the notebook in her hand, and his face did something that she would think about for a long time afterward. It didn't show guilt, didn't show fear, didn't show the collapse of a man caught. It showed recognition. The recognition of a man who has reached the end of a phase and is already thinking about what comes next. "I see you've been busy," he said. "Altieri," Cassian said. "Tell me about Altieri." "Altieri was a liability," Lucien said. "He was managing accounts in a way that was going to expose your father's entire operation inside of 18 months. I solved that problem." "You killed him." "I resolved a structural issue." He said it with a patience that was almost pedagogical. "As I've been resolving structural issues in this organization for 15 years, while your father, and then you, provided the name and the threat and the face of this organization, I provided the functional intelligence that kept it alive." "You've been stealing from it," Cassian said. "I've been building something separate from it, Something with a longer horizon than any criminal organization can sustain. He looked at Cassian with a quality that wasn't contempt. It was something colder than contempt. It was the look of a man who is explaining something to someone he has long since ceased to see as an equal. You were always a transitional instrument. The Vescari name bought time. The syndicate bought infrastructure. What comes next doesn't need either. Fall, Maren said. Lucien looked at her. Dominic Fall, she said. He's the next phase. He has the political cover. You have the financial architecture. You've been building a structure that sits underneath the legitimate city without being part of the criminal world, something that can survive the end of the Vescari organization because it never formally belonged to it. Lucien was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she saw him make a decision, the specific decision of a man who has concluded that the person in front of him is too informed to dismiss and too dangerous to leave with what they know. You're considerably more useful than I anticipated, he said. He looked at Cassian. Both of you in the same room. I hadn't planned for that to happen this quickly, but it simplifies the next step considerably. 3 things happened almost simultaneously. Lucien's hand moved to his jacket. Cassian moved toward him. The study door opened again from the outside, and 2 men Maren recognized as Cassian's own security detail entered the room, but they entered wrong, entered with a quality of direction that wasn't coming from Cassian, that was oriented not toward protecting him, but toward placing themselves between him and the exit. Cassian stopped. He looked at his own men. His jaw was tight. How many? He said. 6 of my people in this building, Lucien said. Not all of you are switched. I want you to understand that. Most of them are loyal to you in the way soldiers are loyal to someone they believe is winning. When the information about the federal murders processes through their understanding of the situation, the calculus will shift on its own. He looked at the 2 men by the door. The federal agents downstairs need to be stalled for another 40 minutes. The men left without looking at Cassian. Maren looked at the notebook in her hand. She looked at the window. She looked at the distance between where she stood and the door. The notebook, Lucien said. Set it on the desk. Why? She said. Because it's the only piece of physical evidence that connects this specific conversation to 2002. And once it's secured, we can have a productive discussion about how this transition happens in a way that's minimally disruptive to everyone. You mean minimally lethal, she said. I mean practical. He looked at her with the expression of a man trying to decide whether honesty or performance will be more efficient. He appeared to choose honesty. You're not a target, Maren. You are a mechanism, a way to access the archive. The fact that you've proven to be more perceptive than I projected doesn't change your utility in what comes next. What does come next? Cassian is removed from operational control. The federal case, which I have been building with Fahal's assistance through the task force structure, provides the legal mechanism for the syndicate's dissolution. Legitimate assets transfer to a holding structure that Fahal administers publicly and I administer in fact. He picked up the secondary phone from the desk and held it. You can walk out of this building. The contract is dissolved. The estate debt is genuinely erased, not as part of Cassian's arrangement, but as part of mine, as a courtesy. And Cassian, she said. Lucien didn't answer. Lucien? Her voice was flat. What happens to Cassian? He's absorbed into the federal process, which I control significantly more than the investigators understand. He set the phone down. It will be managed. She looked at Cassian. He was looking at her with that quality of genuine stillness, not performing calm, actually calm, the calm of a man who is past the point of calculating his own survival and is waiting to see what she does. She thought about the 11 termination notices her father typed and never sent. She thought about the fact that Cassian had structured a behavioral clause into a marriage contract with a woman he'd never met, in clear ink, so she would have it in writing. She thought about the text message. Read the journals. Someone had sent that. Someone had wanted her to find the notebook before Lucien could control what she found. She thought about who in this building had enough access, enough awareness of what Lucien was doing, and enough reason to want it stopped without having the position to stop it themselves. She looked at the door. She thought about Inez. Yet someone pulled together some basics. You won't be expected to use them if they're not to your taste. There's no obligation. The care of it. The specific, deliberate care of it. Someone who wanted her to feel like she had room to move, like the walls weren't as close as they appeared. Inez had sent the text. Inez, who managed the household, who knew everything that came into the building, who had been watching Lucien operate for 15 years from the position of a woman that powerful men universally underestimate. She held the notebook against her chest. She looked at Lucien. "I need to use the bathroom," she said. He looked at her with the patience of a man who has calculated exits. "There's one at the end of the corridor." "I know where it is." She looked at Cassian once. One look, very brief, carrying as much specific information as she could put in a look, which was probably not enough and would have to be. She walked to the door. No one stopped her. In the corridor, she turned toward the bathroom. She walked to it at a pace that was not hurried. She went inside and closed the door and ran the faucet and opened the notebook to the account page and photographed it with her phone. 3 shots, different angles, all sharp. Then she opened her secondary email and composed a draft addressed to 4 recipients. A national news desk, a Federal Investigative Division email she'd found during her internet research at 4 a.m. 2 nights ago, a legal advocacy organization she'd worked with professionally, and her own primary account as a backup. She attached all 3 photographs. She put the draft in her saved drafts without sending it. Then she opened a text to Inez. No greeting. Just, "If I don't send you a code word in the next 2 hours, send the draft from my secondary email." She waited. 7 seconds. 8. The response came as a single character. A period. Maren looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked like someone who had slept badly for 3 nights and spent the morning in the dark with a dead man's notebook, and was now in a room inside a crisis that had been designed for her specifically by someone who had not accounted for the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent her life restoring things other people had decided were beyond saving. She turned off the faucet. She picked up the notebook. She walked back to the study. Lucien looked at her when she entered, at her hands, at the notebook still in them. "I've sent photographs of the account page," she said, "to 4 separate recipients in draft. Someone outside this building has the instruction to transmit if they don't hear from me." She set the notebook on the desk, not handing it to him, just setting it down. "So burning it doesn't help you anymore." The room was quiet. Cassian's face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Not surprise. Something more unguarded than surprise, something that came from a part of his expression that he typically kept completely controlled. Lucien looked at the notebook on the desk, then at her, and his face cycled through something. Several things in rapid succession, the calculations of a man recomputing at speed, and what came out the other side of it was not what she expected. He smiled. "Well," he said, and the smile was not the warmth of the phone call or the performance of the corridor. It was the smile of a man releasing a performance he has found tiresome. "Now we have a real problem," he said. He reached into his jacket. Not for a phone, for a small device, a radio transmitter, nothing more sophisticated than that, the kind of thing you could buy at a commercial outlet. He pressed the single button on its face. From the floor below them came a sound that she felt in her sternum before she processed it as sound. A concussive compression, short and controlled, not an explosion, but the mechanism of one. An explosive charge. Small, targeted. Cassian was already moving. "The server room," he said, not to anyone specifically, just putting the fact into the air. He just destroyed the building's communication infrastructure. Every camera, every recording, every digital record of who has been in this building and when. Lucien set the transmitter on the desk beside the notebook. "Your digital evidence strategy required this building's network to be operational." He looked at Maren. "So now we're back to physical evidence." Her phone was already in her hand. She looked at it. The signal bar was gone. Not reduced, gone. Whatever the charge had hit, it had taken the building's network relay with it. The drafts in her secondary email were sitting on a server she could not currently reach. Inez had not received her text. Lucien looked at her phone and then at her face, and she understood from his expression that he had planned for exactly this contingency. That the possibility of a draft email, of photographs, of a woman in a bathroom doing exactly what she'd done, all of it had been factored and answered. "The notebook," he said, "and you walk out." She looked at Cassian. He was looking back at her. His hands were at his sides. He was not going to tell her what to do. That was deliberate. She could see that it was deliberate, that it was the most important thing he could offer her in this moment, which was the absence of instruction. She looked at the notebook on the desk. She looked at the window. She looked at Lucien Sorel, at his immaculate suit and his silver hair and his 15 years of architecture and patience. And she felt something shift in her chest, something that moved from the cold hollow of fear into something else entirely, a rage so controlled and so complete that it had the quality of a decision rather than an emotion. She picked up the notebook from the desk. "No," she said. And before Lucien could respond, before the two men in the corridor could move, before anything in the room could reorganize itself around what she had just refused, she threw the notebook to Cassian, hard and direct, and turned and ran. She hit the corridor at a full run. The notebook was gone from her hands. She'd thrown it clean and heard Cassian catch it, heard the impact of leather cover against palm, and then she was through the study door and into the hallway and running with the particular urgency of someone who has made a decision that cannot be unmade and is now living inside the consequences of it at full speed. The two men in the corridor reacted a half-second late. That half-second was everything. She went left instead of right, away from the stairwell they expected, toward the service corridor that Inez had shown her on her second day in the building, a narrow passage that ran along the building's north face and connected to a secondary stair used for deliveries and maintenance. She'd walked it once without thinking about why she was memorizing it, the way you memorize exits without consciously deciding to, some part of your brain doing survival mathematics while the rest of you is thinking about other things. She found the service door, hit it shoulder first, and was into the narrow corridor before she heard the men reach the main hallway behind her. The service stair was concrete and metal railing and no emergency lighting. She went down it by feel and momentum, one hand on the rail, 3 floors in the dark, her breath coming hard and her palm burning where the railing's edge caught it on the second-floor turn. She hit the ground level and found the service exit and pushed through it into the alley on the building's north side. Cold air, gray morning. The alley was empty. She ran, not away from the building, toward it, toward the side entrance, the one that Drexel monitored, because Drexel was not Lucien's, and she knew that from the way he'd looked at Cassian in the corridor during the power outage. The specific loyalty of a man who has chosen his person and has not been moved from that choice. She came around the building's corner and nearly ran directly into Drexel, who was standing outside the side entrance with a phone to his ear and an expression that shifted through several things in rapid sequence when he saw her. Surprise, assessment, decision. "Drexel?" She was breathing hard. "Cassian is in the study on 4 with Lucien and at least 2 men who are Lucien's. We need to get back in there." He lowered the phone. "What happened?" Lucien blew the server room. "He's been running double agents inside this building, and he's trying to take the notebook, the archive material from my father, and he's framed Cassian for the 2 murders last night." She put her hand against the wall and breathed. "Federal agents are at the front entrance." "Still there," Drexel said. "I've been stalling." "How long do we have?" 20 minutes before they stop accepting stalling." He looked at her with the quality of a man recalculating. "How many of my people are compromised?" He said 6 in the building. He didn't say which 6. Drexel's jaw worked. "There are 11 on active rotation right now." He was already moving, already opening the side entrance, his hand on the radio clipped to his jacket. "I can't verify in 20 minutes. "Then assume anyone could be and work with the ones you can physically see doing the right thing." She followed him inside. "We need communications restored. Is there a secondary relay, anything that bypasses the main server?" "3rd floor, utility room. There's a hard line that runs directly to the street-level junction. It's not networked. It's a legacy system we kept because the building's original wiring is too integrated to remove." He was moving fast and she was keeping pace. If the server room charge didn't hit the junction box, Lucien's men hit the junction box from the outside. That's what started all of this. She thought about it for a step and a half. But they hit the power feed, not the communication line. Those run on different conduits on this building. I saw the infrastructure diagram and the building materials Inez gave me when I arrived. Drexel looked at her sideways. "I restore buildings for a living," she said. I read infrastructure diagrams the way other people read menus. Third floor, he said. Utility room 3C. They split at the second floor landing. Drexel toward the fourth floor with two men he'd visually confirmed were where they were supposed to be. Maren toward the third floor utility corridor with a radio Drexel handed her and the instructions to use channel 7 only. She found 3C at the end of the utility corridor, a room barely large enough for its contents, pipe manifolds, the building's original electrical panel, and along the east wall, a legacy communication board that looked like something from 3 decades ago, all analog switches and hardwired terminals. She found the external line. She picked up the handset attached to it and heard, after a moment that lasted longer than she could afford, a dial tone. She called the number she'd memorized 2 nights ago at 4 a.m. when she'd been going through her phone doing the kind of research that felt paranoid until it didn't. It rang twice. Federal Investigative Bureau, Chicago Field Office. "My name is Maren Vale," she said. "I'm inside the Vescari building at..." She gave the address. "I have physical evidence connecting a man named Lucien Sorel and a man named Dominic Fall to a conspiracy that includes the murders your agents are currently attributing to Cassian Vescari. I also have reason to believe your agents at the building's front entrance are operating on compromised intelligence that was fed to the task force through channel Sorel controls." She breathed. "I need someone senior, not the team at the front door. Someone who can verify what I'm telling you before Sorel has time to sanitize the evidence." A pause. "Ms. Vale, can you verify your..." "My father was Thomas Vale. He was a witness in 2002 to a meeting involving a man named Altieri and Dominic Fall that connects to the financial architecture Sorel has been building for 15 years, inside and alongside the Vescari organization. My father wrote a witness account in a project notebook. That notebook is currently in this building." She heard something happen in the background on the other end, a quality of attention reorganizing itself. "Send someone who knows those names, right now." She hung up. She looked at the radio in her other hand. Channel 7 was silent. She waited. 12 seconds. 15. The radio crackled. Drexel's voice, low and compressed. "Fourth floor is complicated. Stand by." Complicated. She stood in utility room 3C with her back against the communication board and her heart hitting her ribs and the word complicated expanding in her chest like a bruise. She went back to the stairwell. She went up. The fourth floor corridor was wrong the moment she stepped into it. Wrong in a way she felt before she identified. A quality of held stillness, of space that has recently had violent motion in it that has now stopped. One of the wall sconces was cracked at its base, the glass scattered across the hardwood in a pattern that indicated impact rather than dropping. There was a handprint on the corridor wall at shoulder height, and it was not clean. She followed the corridor to the study. The door was open. Inside, the room had been rearranged by the specific violence of men who were trying to control each other in a small space. One of the leather chairs was on its side. The low table between them had been moved 3 feet from its original position, its surface clear of everything. The glasses, the notebook, everything. The notebook was gone. Cassian was against the far wall, standing with one hand braced on the bookshelf and the other at his side in a way that told her the side was where the pain was. His face was set with the controlled expression of a man managing something that would have felled someone with less practice at managing things. There was a cut above his left eye that was bleeding with the quiet persistence of head wounds. Lucien was not in the room. One of the men who had been stationed at the door was on the floor in a position that indicated he had not chosen to sit down. He was breathing. He was not conscious. The other was gone. "Cassian." She crossed to him. Her hand went to his arm without deciding to, and she felt him take the contact with the same quality of controlled acceptance she was beginning to recognize as his version of gratitude. Not demonstrative, not reciprocal, just received. "Lucien has the notebook," he said. "I know. How bad?" "Ribs, 2, possibly 3. He pushed off the bookshelf, and she felt him absorb the pain of it through her hand on his arm, felt his arm tighten under her grip and then release. "Where did you go?" "Communications, 3rd floor legacy line. I called the FBI field office." She watched his face process that. "Not the team at the front door, the field office directly. I told them about Fall and Altieri and gave them the names. He looked at her for a moment. That was a significant risk. I took a photograph of the account page before I came back from the bathroom, she said. 3 of them. They're in a draft email on my secondary account. The network is down, so I can't send them, but the photographs exist on my phone. She looked at him steadily. Lucien can take the notebook. He can't take my phone without physically taking it from me, and if he does that in front of federal agents, then he creates a new problem bigger than the one he's solving. Cassian straightened. The pain moved across his face and settled somewhere behind his eyes where he kept it. Where is he going with the notebook? Not out the front? The federal agents are still there. Service exit, same way you went. He moved toward the door. She moved with him. He'll go to Fall. Fall has enough political architecture to slow down any federal action while Lucien constructs an alternative narrative for the account page. He'll claim the handwriting was fabricated, the notebook was a plant. He'll build a counter case from whatever resources he has left. How much time does that take? Long enough to matter. He stopped in the corridor and looked at the handprint on the wall, and his jaw tightened. Drexel. The radio in her hand crackled. She handed it to him. Drexel. His voice on the radio was entirely level. Whatever the ribs were doing to him, it was not in his voice. Drexel's response was immediate. South Alley, 2 minutes ago. Black sedan. He had Korev with him. Korev, Cassian said. One of the 6, Maren said. One of my 6. He said it quietly, with the quality of a man noting damage rather than expressing pain about it. He handed the radio back. The sedan will go east. Fall's offices are in the financial district, and Lucien will want to be inside a building with legitimate security before the federal response catches up with the situation. He looked at her. Do you still have the photographs on your phone? She checked. The signal was still dead. The building's relay was still down. But the photos were in her local drafts, saved to the device. Yes. Then here is what happens, he said. I go after Lucien. You stay in this building and you give your phone to the senior FBI agent when they arrive. Not the team at the front door, but whoever comes in response to your call. He looked at her. The photographs are enough to open an investigation into Fall. The investigation into Fall is enough to expose the infrastructure Lucien built inside the task force. The whole thing unravels from there. And you, she said. I go after Lucien. Cassian. She stepped in front of him. She was aware that this was a slightly absurd thing to do, a woman of her size in a corridor, positioning herself between a man with broken ribs and a door. But she did it anyway because there was something in his face that she recognized, the specific expression of someone who has decided to absorb consequences that belong to a larger system because it's faster than waiting for the system to absorb them itself. You go after Lucien alone with 3 broken ribs, and he has at least 1 man with him. And whatever case I build with these photographs becomes significantly more complicated if you are arrested outside Fall's building covered in evidence of a fight. The alternative is he walks. The alternative is we do this correctly. She held his gaze. Where would Lucien take the notebook before going to Fall? Somewhere to copy it, photograph it himself, create redundancy in case it gets intercepted? Cassian was quiet. Then, he has a facility, not affiliated with this organization. A private arrangement, a property in the industrial district he's held under a shell company for years. I only knew about it because Altieri mentioned it once, years before his death, and I filed it away. The steel mill, she said. He looked at her. Your briefing document for the Thursday event mentioned a decommissioned steel processing facility in the 16th Ward that the Hargrove Foundation was considering for a development project, she said. The foundation's primary donor is listed as a holding company called Soraline Ventures. She watched it land on his face. I read the briefing document very thoroughly. He exhaled. It cost him something in the ribs, and she could see that. You read a charity auction briefing document and identified a shell company. I restore things. I look for things that don't belong in the original structure. She put the radio in her jacket pocket. If that's where he's going, it's 20 minutes from here, long enough for us to make it there before he's finished copying the account page, and long enough for me to reach the field office again and give them the location. Us, he said. Yes. Maren. You know what you're walking into, she said. I know what the notebook contains. Between those two things, we have a better chance together than separately. She looked at him. And you have 3 broken ribs. Something moved through his expression. It arrived and departed before she could fully name it, but it left something behind. A quality in how he was looking at her that hadn't been there when she'd arrived at this building 6 days ago as a woman with a signed contract and a duffel bag. There's a car in the north basement, he said. Drexel's personal vehicle, not in the building's registry. They went. The steel mill arrived out of the industrial district like a scar. A sprawling complex of decommissioned processing buildings set back from the road behind a chain-link perimeter that had once been security infrastructure and was now just a boundary. The kind of thing that keeps honest people out and means nothing to anyone else. The main structure was a cathedral of corroded steel and broken glass, 6 stories of processing floor and catwalks and conveyor systems that had been still for years but still held the shape of the work they'd done. Furnace housings, slag channels, the skeletal overhead cranes that had moved molten material from station to station and now hung in place like frozen gestures. Cassian had driven. She hadn't argued about it. His face was tight and white around the edges, but his hands on the wheel were exact. And she'd spent the 20 minutes on the legacy phone she'd brought from Utility Room 3C, a handset she'd pulled from the wall bracket and carried because it had a battery backup and a signal that operated independently of the building's network. She'd reached the field office again. Different person this time. Someone senior, someone who said the names Fall and Sorel and Altieri with the specific quality of a person encountering a knot they've been trying to find the end of for a long time. She'd given the steel mill address. She'd given the photographs through a number the agent provided, a direct receive line, watching the images transmit from her phone one by one with the feeling of something being released from her hands permanently. The agent had said 40 minutes. 40 minutes was not fast enough for what was already inside that building. They went in through a breach in the perimeter fence on the west side, a section where the chain link had been cut and resecured with wire ties, in a way that looked intact from 20 feet but opened with a single pull. Someone had prepared this. Recently. Inside the perimeter, the ground was broken concrete and metal debris and the particular darkness of large industrial spaces, which is different from regular darkness because it has scale to it. The darkness of a space that swallows you without closing around you. The darkness of a room the size of a city block. They crossed the yard to the main building's side entrance. A door that had been locked was not locked. The wire tie detail again. Someone had been through here preparing, staging, setting up a space to work in. Inside. The processing floor was immense and cold, and full of the sounds of a large metal structure settling around them. The tick and groan of steel responding to temperature, the distant percussion of something loose moving in the wind from a broken window high above. The furnace housings rose 20 feet on either side, silent and massive. Overhead, the catwalks crossed and recrossed the processing floor in a grid that was partially intact and partially gone. Sections missing where corrosion had taken the structure, the remaining sections accessible by ladder from the floor. Light was coming from above. Not overhead lighting, portable work lights, the kind that run on battery packs, positioned on the catwalk level approximately 40 feet above the floor. She could see the diffuse glow of them from below, the way they lit the underside of the catwalk structure and sent down a pale, cold illumination that made the floor navigable without fully revealing it. Cassian put his hand on her arm. She stopped. He pointed upward, then to the east. She followed the direction and found it, the shape of 2 men on the catwalk, moving with the careful quality of people who know the structure is not fully reliable and are treating it accordingly. One of them was carrying something. The shape of it was familiar in her hands from carrying it herself. The notebook. Cassian pointed to the ladder on the south wall, then to himself, then to the ladder on the north side, then to her. She shook her head. She pointed to his ribs. He looked at her for a moment in the dark with the work lights 40 feet above painting the edges of his face. Then he made a concession she understood was significant by the quality of its silence. He pointed to her and then to the north ladder and then touched 2 fingers to his own eyes and then pointed to the level above, which she understood as, go up, keep eyes on the notebook, don't engage. She went to the north ladder. She climbed with her hands and her breath, and the cold metal of the rungs biting through her palms, and the darkness below her deepening as she rose, and the light above her growing from diffuse to direct, until she pulled herself up onto the catwalk level and crouched behind a furnace exhaust housing and let her eyes adjust. The catwalk ran east-west in front of her. 40 feet to her left, Lucian was standing at a portable work table, a folding surface someone had brought in and set up beside one of the battery-powered lights. He had the notebook open on the table. He had a phone in his hand, photographing the account page with the methodical patience of a man who has been patient for 15 years and can afford to be patient for another 5 minutes. Korev stood 6 feet behind him, facing east toward where the south ladder would be. He was holding something at his side. He was looking directly at Maren. She went very still. The housing she was crouched behind had a 3-foot profile, enough cover if she stayed below it, not enough if she was already visible above it. She measured the angle, Korev's sight line, the distance. He started toward her. She stood up. There was no point in not standing up. "Lucien," Korev said without inflection, without urgency. Lucien looked up from the notebook. He found her on the catwalk, and his expression did what it had done in the study. That rapid recalculation, that swift reorganization of his understanding of the situation, which resolved this time into something that was almost admiration and was entirely cold. "You're persistent," he said. "Where's the federal cooperation in your plan?" she said. "The task force intelligence you said you controlled. Fall's political cover, the redirected financial case. If all of that exists, you don't need to be in an abandoned steel mill at 8 in the morning making copies of a notebook." She kept her voice even. The catwalk moved slightly under her. A slow structural oscillation, the building breathing. "You're here because something broke faster than you planned. The field office call I made went somewhere your infrastructure doesn't reach." Lucian set the phone down. He gave her his full attention with the quality of someone who has decided to stop running 2 things at once. "What did you tell them?" "Everything I knew. Everything the notebook contains." She took a step toward him on the catwalk. The structure shifted again, more noticeably. "And I sent the photographs. You can have the physical notebook. The information is already distributed." A sound from the south side of the building. The creak of the south ladder, metal taking weight. Lucien heard it. Korev heard it. Both of them oriented toward it. Maren moved, not toward Lucien, toward the notebook on the folding table. 10 steps on unstable catwalk that swayed and rang under her feet with the sound of a structure being asked to do things it was not designed to do anymore. And she was not thinking about the 40-foot drop to the processing floor below or the gap in the catwalk railing where a section had corroded away 8 feet ahead of her, or any of it. She was thinking only about her hands on that notebook, because if she could get it off the table and get it over the edge, tear out the account page and get it to Cassian below. Korev caught her arm. He was faster than she'd calculated, faster than a man his size should have been. And he had her left arm in both hands, with a grip that was not gentle and was not trying to be, spinning her around and away from the table with the efficiency of a man who has removed people from places they weren't supposed to be many times before. She went with the spin instead of against it, which was the only thing that kept her from going down. And she came around with her elbow and caught him in the face with the part of the elbow that is not soft. He made a sound. His grip loosened. She pulled free and grabbed the notebook off the table with her right hand and ran. The catwalk ahead of her had the gap in the railing, but she'd seen it from 10 feet, clocked it, filed it, and she went wide of it along the inner edge, her left hand on the catwalk's center handrail, which was present even where the outer railing was gone. And she went fast, and she did not look down. Behind her, Korev was back on his feet. She could hear him. She could also hear, from the south side, the catwalk shaking with the weight and rhythm of someone climbing onto it fast. Cassian came over the south edge of the catwalk in a single movement that told her the ribs were not going to stop him, and also that they were costing him something significant. She could see it in his face when he straightened, in the quality of his breath, in the way his left arm stayed close to his body while his right was free. Korev stopped. He looked at Cassian, then back at Maren with the notebook, then back at Cassian. The calculation was visible on his face, the one he was running about which problem to solve first. Cassian solved the problem of his hesitation by closing the distance between them. What happened next on the catwalk was not elegant. It was not cinematic in the way of constructed violence. It was the violence of men who are in pain and are tired and are past the point of technique, which is a different thing entirely. Short and brutal, and conducted in a space that swayed and rang under their weight and dropped debris from its underside with every impact. Maren pressed her back against the catwalk's inner wall and held the notebook with both arms crossed over it and watched Cassian work with 3 broken ribs and a fury that was entirely controlled. Not rage, not heat, but the absolute cold commitment of a man resolving a problem that has been building for 15 years. Lucian watched from beside the folding table. She could see him watching. She could see him not running. He had nowhere to run. He understood that now. The field office call had closed the exits, and she could see him doing what men like Cassian do when they run out of architecture. He was preparing a position, a narrative, a version of events that could survive what was coming. He looked at her across the catwalk. "The notebook won't be enough," he said. "You understand that. A handwritten account from a dead man. Fall's lawyers will challenge provenance in front of 3 different judges before the photographs reach a grand jury." "Maybe," she said, "but you're standing in a building you own through a shell company at 8 in the morning, photographing evidence you claimed didn't exist. The lawyers will have to explain that first." His jaw tightened by a fraction. "This will take years." "Yes," she agreed, "it will." Korev hit the catwalk railing, and the section he hit was not the one that was missing, but it was the one adjacent to it, and the impact traveled through the corroded steel, and the adjacent section moved, shifted outward along its remaining connection points, and Maren heard the sound of metal separating from metal, the specific register of a structural failure in progress, and she grabbed the center handrail and held. The catwalk shuddered. A 6-foot section of outer railing fell. She heard it hit the processing floor 40 feet below with a sound that rearranged the air in the building. Cassian pulled back from Korev and looked at the structure under his feet, and then at Maren, and she could see him calculating. The stability of what remained, the distance to the south ladder, the weight distribution of 3 people on a catwalk that had just demonstrated its reluctance to support them. Korev lunged, not at Cassian, at Maren, at the notebook. He crossed the catwalk in 3 strides, and she turned and ran, and the catwalk moved under both of them with the increasingly urgent communication of a structure telling the people on it that it is done, that its patience with this situation has expired, that what happens next is a matter of physics rather than intention. And she ran until she hit the north ladder and grabbed it and went down, one-handed. The notebook in her right arm against her chest, her left hand on the ladder, her feet finding rungs by contact rather than sight, descending with the controlled desperation of someone who has decided to trust physics over fear. She hit the processing floor and moved clear of the ladder and looked up. Korev was at the top of the north ladder, looking down at her. He looked at the distance. He looked at the catwalk, at the gap in it, at the section that had separated from its mounting, at the structure's current quality of stability. And he made the decision that she would have made, which was to stay on the ladder and start down. Cassian was across the catwalk, moving toward the south ladder. Lucien was at the folding table. He had not moved. He was on his phone. His voice carried down to the floor below in fragments. "Location is compromised. We need the secondary position. Tell Fall." "Lucien," Cassian said from the catwalk. Loud enough to carry, quiet enough to be precise. Lucien looked up. "It's done," Cassian said. Not with triumph, with the exhausted finality of a man stating a fact about the weather. And then the sound Maren had been half hearing for the last 4 minutes resolved itself into something specific and definitive. Vehicles. Multiple vehicles from multiple directions, and above that sound the specific vocal frequencies of law enforcement approaching a structure. The organized, amplified voices of people who have come in numbers and are announcing themselves as a professional courtesy before they stop extending it. She looked at the notebook in her arms. Her father's handwriting, the account page, the warehouse, the winter of 2002. All of it. She looked up at Lucien on the catwalk above her, at Cassian moving along the structure toward the south descent, at the work lights throwing their cold illumination across 15 years of architecture that was coming down. Her phone buzzed. Signal restored. The field office had a local repeater on their vehicles, and it had reached her the moment they entered the perimeter. One message. Inez. 3 words. Draft is sent. Maren closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, felt the cold floor of the steel mill under her feet, and the weight of the notebook in her arms, and the particular sensation of a thing that has been falling for a very long time finally finding the ground. Then she opened her eyes, because it wasn't over yet. Lucien was still above her on a compromised catwalk with a phone in his hand, and Cassian was still coming down with broken ribs, and law enforcement was 30 seconds from breaching the perimeter. And she looked up at the fractured, beautiful, terrible architecture of the catwalk grid above her, and she held the notebook tighter, and she waited for what came next. The first federal agent through the perimeter was a woman. Maren registered that detail the way you register small, specific things in moments of extreme adrenaline, with a sharpness that has nothing to do with relevance, just the brain's insistence on cataloging the world even as the world is coming apart. The agent was compact, mid-40s, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who has breached enough compromised structures to have stopped performing urgency. She had 3 agents behind her and 2 more splitting toward the building's east and west faces, and she came through the main entrance of the processing floor with her eyes already up, already reading the catwalk level, already locating the work lights, already seeing Lucien above and Cassian on the south descent and Maren on the floor with a notebook pressed against her chest. She looked at Maren. Vele? Yes. Agent Corrida, Chicago field office. She didn't stop moving, crossed the floor toward the south ladder, even as she spoke, her team fanning out around her with the practiced efficiency of a rehearsed response. The photographs transmitted. We have them. She glanced up at Lucien, who was still on the catwalk above the folding table, still on his phone, still doing the last thing a man like Lucien does when the architecture collapses around him, which is attempt to construct a new one from whatever materials are still available. Is that Sorrel? Yes. And the man on the south ladder? Cassian Vescari. Maren kept her voice level. He has broken ribs. He has not committed the murders you were briefed on this morning. That briefing came through channel's Sorrel controls inside the task force. She watched Corrida process this without slowing down. The notebook I'm holding is the original physical evidence. Photographs are on my phone. I can walk you through both. Corrida looked at her for a full second, the evaluating look of a person deciding how much of what they're hearing to immediately act on versus hold for later verification. Then she nodded once, which Maren understood as, I'm not dismissing this, and I'm not confirming it yet, and keep talking. Above them, the catwalk made a sound. It was the sound of a structure deciding, not the sharp report of immediate failure, but the slow, granular dissolution of corroded connection points that have been pushed past their final tolerance. A grinding, progressive separation, metal pulling free of metal with the patience of something that has been working toward this conclusion for years. The section beside the folding table, the one adjacent to the gap, the one Korev had impacted, dropped its east mounting. The folding table went with it. The battery-powered work light went with it. The phone Lucien had been speaking into spun away from his hand as he grabbed the center handrail, and the phone fell 40 feet and hit the processing floor and split apart without drama, and the work light hit beside it and went dark, and the folding table hit beside that, and the sound of it filled the building for 3 full seconds. Lucien was still on the catwalk, holding the center rail with both hands. The section under him was intact, for now, but the adjacent failure had changed the structural dynamic, and she could see from the floor that the remaining connections were moving in a way that connections are not supposed to move. Cassian was off the south ladder. He was on the processing floor, one hand at his left side, breathing in the controlled way of someone managing pain as a technical problem. He looked at the catwalk above. He looked at Lucien. Come down, he said. His voice carried in the space without effort. Not a command, a statement of the only available option. Lucien looked down at the processing floor, at the agents spreading through it, at Cassian, at Maren with the notebook. His face in the dimness of the remaining ambient light had the quality of a man standing at the edge of something he spent 15 years walking toward, and has only now, at the moment of arrival, understood the true dimensions of. He began moving toward the south ladder. He moved carefully, with both hands on the center rail, testing each step before weighting it. The catwalk responded to his movement with the ongoing complaints of a structure that has stopped making promises, and the agents below tracked him with the careful attention of people who have calculated that getting him down safely is preferable to the alternative. He was 8 feet from the south ladder when the second mounting failed, not the section under him, the section behind him, the east span letting go entirely, the corroded bolts surrendering in sequence, the steel dropping away from the wall mounting and swinging down and inward like a struck door, and the impact of it traveling through the remaining structure in a wave that Maren felt in the floor beneath her feet. Lucien's hands tightened on the center rail. The rail itself torqued, the bracket holding it at the south end pulling free of the catwalk deck. And she watched him understand what was happening with the specific clarity of a man who has spent his life reading situations and is reading this one correctly and too late. Cassian moved. He went to the south ladder and went up it with the speed of a man who has made a decision that the pain in his ribs is not part of the calculation, and she watched him go up those rungs with his left arm, doing less than his right, and his breath audible from the floor below, and the entire movement having the quality of something she would not be able to describe afterward in a way that did it justice. Not heroism, which is a word that packages things too neatly, but something rawer than that, the thing that lives underneath heroism, which is a person choosing to go toward a thing they have every physical reason to go away from. He reached the catwalk level. The remaining structure held him. It did not feel like it was going to continue holding him. Lucien. He was 6 feet away. The center rail was still in Lucien's hand, still attached at the north end, and the section under Lucien was still connected at one point on the west wall, one point which was doing the work of 4. Lucien looked at him, and what was on his face then was not what Maren expected. Not fear, not calculation, not the rapid reconfiguration she'd watched him perform all morning. It was something older and simpler and more terrible than any of those things. It was the face of a man who has spent so long building something that he has forgotten how to be anything other than the builder of it, and who is now watching it go and discovering that there is nothing underneath. "You should let me fall," Lucien said. "I know," Cassian said. He extended his right hand. The west wall connection point failed with the sound of a bolt shearing, a single, definitive snap, and the section dropped at the west end and the center rail went with it, and Lucien went with the rail, and Cassian's hand found Lucien's wrist in the same second, and the impact of catching a falling man with 3 broken ribs produced a sound from Cassian that Maren heard from the floor and that she would carry with her for a long time. He held. Both of them suspended, Cassian with his right hand on the ladder's side rail and his right arm extended over the catwalk's edge, and Lucien's wrist in his grip, and 40 feet of empty industrial air below Lucien's feet, for a duration that Maren's brain recorded as much longer than it actually was. 2 agents were already on the south ladder. Corrida was directing from the floor with the precise economy of someone managing a situation that has specific parameters and a finite window. They got ropes to Cassian. They got Lucien up. They got Cassian off the catwalk and down the ladder and onto the processing floor. And the moment his feet touched the concrete, he put his back against the wall and his hand at his ribs and breathed with the careful shallowness of a man who has used everything and is now doing triage on the inventory. Maren went to him. She didn't say anything. She stood beside him and put her hand on his arm. The same arm she'd touched in the corridor upstairs, the same point of contact, the same quality of received rather than reciprocated. And he looked at her with an expression she couldn't read and didn't need to. They stood like that while Lucien was cuffed on the processing floor 12 feet away, while Corrida spoke into her radio in a low, rapid voice, while the sounds of additional vehicles arrived outside the perimeter, and the processing floor filled with the organized presence of a response that had been 40 minutes behind the situation and was now, finally, here. Korev had come down the north ladder during the catwalk failure and was sitting against the north wall with an agent standing beside him, and the expression of a man who has been calculating his options and has arrived at the conclusion that there are none. He looked once at Lucien on the floor. Lucien did not look back. Corrida came to Maren. "I need the notebook and your phone." Maren held out both. She'd been holding the notebook for so long that releasing it felt like a change in atmospheric pressure, a physical adjustment, the body noticing the absence of something it had organized itself around. "The account page," Maren said, "third from the back. My father's handwriting. The date at the top is January 2002. "I'll find it." Corita took both items and looked at Maren with the quality of a person making a note. "You called the field office twice from inside a building with no operational network, and then tracked a suspect to a secondary location and preserved physical evidence under direct physical confrontation." She paused. "You're not law enforcement." "I restore old buildings," Maren said. "Same skill set, different application." Corita looked at her for one more moment and then moved away, and Maren leaned against the wall beside Cassian and looked at the processing floor of the steel mill, at the fallen catwalk sections, at the broken work light, at the scattered debris of a structure that had been declining for years and had finally reached the end of that process. And she breathed. "Your ribs," she said. "Hospital," he said. "After." "After what?" He looked at her. "After I know what's happening." What was happening took most of the day to become clear, and it did not become clear all at once. It assembled itself in stages, the way large things assemble, piece by piece, each piece arriving with its own complications. Dominic Fall was taken into federal custody at 11:40 a.m. at his financial district office, where he had been on the phone with 3 lawyers simultaneously when agents arrived. The lawyers made the standard statements. Fall made none. He sat in the room that was offered to him and looked at the table and had the specific expression of a man who has known for some time that a particular day would come and has spent that time not preparing for it but simply not thinking about it, because some things are too large to prepare for and too inevitable to avoid. The task force that had been assembled to target the Vescari organization was suspended pending an internal review of the intelligence channels it had been using. The review was opened that afternoon. 6 of the task force's 14 intelligence inputs were found to root through analysis structures that had Lucian Sorrell's operational fingerprints on them, not directly, not with his name anywhere on the architecture, but in the method of it, in the specific way the information had been packaged and presented, which Corita later described to Maren as looking like someone who had learned to write in a particular style and couldn't fully disguise it even when they were trying. The 2 murdered captains, Cassian's men, found the morning the building's power was cut, were connected to Lucian through a phone recovered from Korev, who had made the decision that cooperation was his most productive remaining option and had made it early enough in the day to matter. The phone contained enough to establish that Lucian had arranged the deaths and arranged their arrangement, the staging designed to implicate Cassian, the intelligence about the men's federal contact fed to Lucian by his task force access, and then used to eliminate them before they could complicate his timeline. The federal murders charge against Cassian was suspended by late afternoon. Corita used the word suspended rather than cleared, and Maren understood from the way she said it that the distinction mattered legally and would continue to matter for some time, but that the practical consequence was the same. Cassian was not arrested. He spent 4 hours in a federal interview room answering questions from Corita and 2 colleagues, and Maren sat in a waiting room outside and drank bad coffee from a machine and looked at her phone, which had been returned to her after the photographs were extracted and documented, and read a message from Inez that said only, "The draft reached everyone it needed to reach. I sent it the moment I had signal. I'm sorry it took as long as it did." Maren typed back, "It was enough. Thank you." A pause. Then, "Your father would have found a way too. He was that kind of man." She put the phone face down on her knee and looked at the wall of the waiting room and let that sentence do what it needed to do, which took a few minutes and was not comfortable and was necessary anyway. Cassian came out of the interview room at 4:15. He had seen a medical team during a break. She'd insisted through Corita, who had turned out to be the kind of person who responds to clearly stated practical requirements with clearly stated practical solutions. And his ribs had been confirmed as 3 fractures, wrapped and documented. He moved differently now, with the specific careful economy of someone who has been told the exact parameters of an injury and is working within them. He sat down beside her in the waiting room. He looked at the coffee machine. He looked at the cup in her hand. "Is it terrible?" he said. "Catastrophically," she said. He stood up and got one anyway, and came back and sat down, and they sat in the waiting room of a federal building in Chicago on an October afternoon and drank bad coffee and did not say anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. "Inez sent the draft," she said eventually. "I know, Corita told me." He looked at his cup. "Inez has been with this household for 11 years. She watched Lucien operate inside it for 9 of those years, and she never had anything she could do about it." He paused. "She knew about your father, about the history between the families. She knew the debt wasn't what it appeared to be. Why didn't she come to you?" "She didn't know how much I knew, or whether I was already compromised." He looked at her. "She sent the text to you instead, the unknown number." Maren thought about an 11-year-old woman in a household that contained a man like Lucien Sorrel, watching and knowing and waiting for a moment when what she knew could be useful to someone who could use it. The patience of it. The specific, costly, invisible patience of someone who has no institutional power and has learned to work with what they have. "She should know it mattered," Maren said. "I'll tell her." The late afternoon light came through the waiting room's single window at an angle that put a long rectangle of gold across the floor between them, and Maren looked at it and thought about the estate outside Chicago, about the water stain in the entry hall and the boarded east window, and the heart pine floors that warped in 3 places she could identify by sound. She thought about her father sitting at that kitchen table on an ordinary morning in 2003, looking at 11 names on 11 pages, calculating what it would cost and deciding it didn't matter. "The original loan," she said, "the 2003 amount, before Lucien altered the terms." "Manageable," Cassian said, "in the context of the estate's assets, repayable over time." "Then the contract was built on fraudulent terms," he said, "which means it's voidable." He held her gaze. "You can walk away from this, Maren. The fraud is documented. The estate foreclosure was initiated on the basis of the altered debt. With the authentic figure, the foreclosure has no legal foundation. The property is yours." She looked at him. "Is that what you want?" He was quiet for a moment. "What I want is not the relevant question. What the contract actually obligates." "Cassian." She turned to face him more directly. "I didn't ask what the contract obligates. I asked what you want." He looked at her. The waiting room was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. The rectangle of light on the floor had shifted 3 inches. "I want," he said carefully, "to not have manufactured the circumstances that put you in that kitchen." He said it with the flatness of someone stating a fact about themselves that they have looked at honestly and have not been able to improve. "Whatever happened after you signed, Oshar, whatever we built or found in the process of it, the beginning of it was someone else's construction, and I was part of it even if I didn't design it, because I went to that house with a document that I knew had complications I hadn't fully investigated. You told me the terms might have been altered after you signed." "Yes." She held his gaze. "After I signed, which means you told me, which is not nothing." He looked down at the cup in his hands. "I spent years honoring a promise I made to your father that he never asked me to make. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because your father was, as I told you the day we met, an honest man, and in my world that is genuinely rare, and it matters." He stopped. "And then someone used that history to build a trap around both of us, and I walked into it, and I brought you in with me. You also caught a man who was trying to kill you rather than let him fall 40 feet. That's a separate matter." "Is it?" She watched him. "You could have let him go. You had every reason to, and you went up a ladder with 3 broken ribs and caught him anyway." She let that sit for a moment. "That's not strategy. That's not calculation. That's what you are when there's nothing left to be except what you actually are." He looked at her. "I'm not asking for the marriage we contracted," she said. "I'm not asking for the performance we built for a charity auction or the narrative your legal team constructed." She folded her hands around the bad coffee and looked at the rectangle of light on the floor. "I'm asking you what you want when you take all of that away." The waiting room held its silence. "You," he said, simply, without the architecture of qualification around it. She nodded once. She picked up her coffee and finished it and set the cup down. Then we'll figure out what that looks like, she said, without a contract. What followed was not quick and was not simple, because nothing that involves federal investigations and fraudulent financial instruments and the dissolution of a criminal organization's operational structure is quick or simple. It was months. It was testimony and documentation and legal proceedings and the particular endurance required of people who are asked to tell the same true story to multiple institutional audiences until the story becomes, through sheer repetition, undeniable. Lucien Sorel was charged on 11 counts. The charges included the arranged deaths of 2 men, 15 years of financial fraud, the manufacture of fraudulent debt instruments, and conspiracy to obstruct federal investigation. His legal team was effective and expensive and ultimately insufficient because the documentation was comprehensive and Korev's cooperation was detailed, and Fall, once he understood the dimensions of what he was facing, made the calculation that partial cooperation was more useful to him than total solidarity, which meant that the architecture Lucien had spent 15 years building became the primary evidence against him. Dominic Fall faced separate proceedings. The political cover he'd constructed was extensive enough that the process took longer and the outcomes were more qualified, but the account page from Thomas Vale's notebook, authenticated by 3 independent document examiners, and corroborated by financial records unearthed in the subsequent Sorel investigation, established his connection to Altieri and to the warehouse meeting of January 2002 with enough specificity that the proceedings that followed were a matter of when rather than whether. The fraudulent debt against the Vale estate was formally voided in December. The estate foreclosure proceedings were withdrawn. Maren drove out to the property on a Wednesday afternoon in early winter when the sky was the particular flat gray of the Illinois December, and the oaks along the access road had lost everything except their shape. And she sat in the car for a while at the second bend where the house first became visible, just looking at it. The sagging porch, the boarded window, the water stain that a sensible person would have repaired before it stained. She got out of the car and walked to the front door and let herself in. And the house smelled like dust and cedar and cold air and the chemical undertone of old conservation materials. And she stood in the entry hall and looked up at the ceiling stain and thought about everything that had happened since she'd last stood in this exact spot and watched a convoy of black SUVs park on her gravel. She called a restoration contractor the following Monday. Cassian dissolved the remaining criminal operations of the Vescari organization over the course of 6 months, working with federal oversight that was itself a novel arrangement, negotiated by lawyers on both sides who found the situation without clear precedent and approached it with the careful interest of people encountering something genuinely new. The legitimate assets, real estate holdings, several financial instruments, the building in the city that had been his household, were transferred to a foundation. The foundation's mandate was specific: investment in the rehabilitation of neighborhoods in which the Vescari organization had, over decades, extracted value without returning it. It was not absolution. He didn't present it as absolution, and no one with clear eyes received it as such. It was restitution, which is a different thing, smaller and more honest and harder to perform because it requires acknowledging the specific shape of what was taken rather than making a general gesture of regret. Ines ran the foundation's administrative operations. She did it with the same organized efficiency with which she had run the household, and she did it without fanfare, and she was very good at it. Maren took the position of restoration director, which had not been offered to her in those words. It had arrived more organically than that, through the process of her involvement in the foundation's early asset assessments, which required someone who could look at a building and tell you what it had been, and what it could be, and what it would cost in materials and time, and the particular human stubbornness required to take something broken and make it functional again. She was, as it turned out, very good at that. She restored the estate herself over the following year. Not alone. She had contractors, she had specialists, she had a structural engineer she trusted, and an electrician who'd worked with her father and who cried once, quietly, in the East Wing, when he realized what building he was working in. But she was there every day, making decisions about what to preserve and what to replace, and how to honor what a thing had been while making it capable of being something new. She opened the East Wing in the spring as a community arts and documentation center, with the archive, Her father's 40 years of restoration records, properly cataloged now, accessible to researchers and students, and anyone who wanted to know what things had looked like before time got to them. On the first day it was open to the public, a woman in her 70s came in and stood in front of the archive display for a long time. Maren recognized her. One of the 11 names. One of the people who had kept their job in the winter of 2003 because a man had done a difficult thing without asking anyone's permission. The woman looked at the photographs and the documents and the notebooks arranged in their cases, and then she looked at Maren and she didn't say anything, and Maren nodded and looked away to give her privacy, and that was enough. Cassian came to the estate for the first time on an evening in late October, a year and 6 days after she'd stood on the porch steps and watched his convoy come down the access road. He parked his own car, a single car, no convoy, no security visible, though she understood from experience that visible and present were not the same thing, and walked to the front door. The porch didn't sag anymore. The east window was no longer boarded. The water stain in the entry hall was gone, the ceiling repaired and repainted, and the source of the leak addressed from the roof level, so it would not happen again. She let him in. She showed him the archive room, which he looked at with the quality of attention he gave to things that mattered to him. He looked at the notebooks in their cases. He looked at the 2003 folder open to the employee roster, the 11 names visible. He never told anyone, Cassian said. No. Not even you. No. She looked at the roster. I think he felt that telling someone would have made it a story about himself. He didn't want it to be that. They had dinner at the kitchen table, the same kitchen, different circumstances in every way that mattered. She'd cooked, which was not something she'd done with any particular attention in the past year, and which she did now with the deliberate focus of someone choosing normalcy as an act rather than a default. It was a good dinner, simple, the kind of meal that doesn't announce itself. After, they sat at the table with the remains of it between them and the kitchen light making the room warm, in a way it hadn't been the first time he'd sat here, and he reached into his jacket and set something on the table. A document, legal size. She recognized the format. She looked at it, looked at him. I've been carrying them for a while, he said. I didn't know what to do with them. He kept his voice even, but she could hear what was underneath the evenness. Not vulnerability exactly, but the absence of the particular armor that a man like Cassian wears so long he sometimes forgets he's wearing it. They're unsigned. The dissolution is unsigned. It was always your choice to file. She picked up the document. She read it with the same care she'd given the original contract, which felt like a long time ago and also felt like last week. She read it to the end. She set it down. She stood up from the table and went to the kitchen drawer and found a pen. She came back and looked at him, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that she had learned, over the course of a year that had included more intensity than most people encounter in a decade, contained more than they initially gave away. She didn't sign the document. She tore it, cleanly, once, across the middle, and set both halves on the table. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket. She'd been carrying it for 3 days, waiting for the right moment in the way you wait for the right moment for the things that matter. And she set a plain silver band on the table between them, not the one from the contract. That one had been part of the performance, the staged alliance, the narrative for a charity auction attended by people performing their own careful versions of themselves. This one she'd chosen herself, alone, in a shop on a Tuesday afternoon because she wanted the weight of it to be her own decision rather than someone else's logistics. He looked at it. He looked at her. Not because I owe you anything, she said. Not because of a contract or a debt or anything that someone else constructed between us. She held his gaze. Because I watched you go up a ladder with 3 broken ribs to catch a man who was trying to destroy you, and I think that's the most honest thing I've ever seen. He picked up the ring. He turned it once in his fingers, feeling the weight of it. Then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd seen in the waiting room, and in the dark of the steel mill, and in the corridor of a building with the power cut. The expression that lived under the architecture of everything else he showed the world, which was simply present. Entirely and completely present in the moment he was in, without calculation, without distance, without the management of impression. He put the ring on his own finger. She sat back down across from him. She looked at the halved document on the table between them. She looked at his hand, at the plain silver catching the kitchen light. Outside, the October wind moved through the oaks the way it had always moved through them, indifferent to the specific dramas of the people sheltered beneath. The house settled around them with the sounds it had always made, the three soft complaints of the heart pine floors in their familiar places, the particular voice of the east wing as the temperature dropped, the old bones of a structure that had survived contradictions and additions, and the love of people who could not quite afford it. Maren Vale looked at the kitchen of her father's house, her house, restored and repaired and converted into something that could hold more than one family's story now. And she thought about what restoration actually was, at its core. Not making something new, not returning something to a state it had never left, but finding what was still structurally sound under everything that had been damaged and choosing to build from there. She reached across the table and picked up the two halves of the unsigned divorce document. She set them on top of each other. She slid them to the edge of the table and let them fall into the kitchen trash. Cassian watched her do it. "What happens next?" he said. She looked at him across the table of her father's kitchen, in the house she'd come back to bury and had chosen instead to save, with the oaks moving outside and the archive open in the east wing, and the weight of the past year settling into something she did not yet have a word for, but recognized as the beginning of a different kind of ordinary. "We figure it out," she said. And that was enough. That was, after everything, exactly enough.